This week in the Boardroom, brought to you by NYSE Governance Services, Corporate Board Member, along with Governance Knowledge Partners, the Center for Audit Quality, and Grant Thornton, and contributing partners, National Investor Relations Institute, and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.
Welcome to this edition of This Week in the Boardroom. I'm T.K. Kerstetter, Chairman of NYSE Governance Services, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the show. Joining me again this week is Trent Gazzaway, who's the National Managing Partner of Professional Standards for Grant Thornton. Welcome, Trent.
Thank you.
We're going to be talking about sort of key issues facing audit committees, but really we're going to be talking about things that we didn't get a chance to talk about last week. Last week we talked about composition and structure. This week we want to talk about sort of things that are really on the hot list for a audit committee. So first of all, I think we want to talk about the 900-pound gorilla that's always in the room when we start to talk about risk, and that's cyber attacks and data security. Certainly have seen incidents recently, very damaging. I got to believe it's the #1 issue that's sitting in the minds and hearts of audit committees today.
Yes, it is. And you know, it's interesting when we look back over the last 10 years or so, what was occupying most audit committees, and even in some respects most boards, was Sarbanes-Oxley and Section 404 and the internal control stuff. It was a regulatory requirement. But now we actually have boards and audit committees squarely focused on something that is a real business risk. And in that sense, it's good that they've shifted that focus, because this is something that really does need to be addressed. And it's something that most boards, I think we talked a little bit about this last week, most boards and audit committees don't have a lot of talent that understands cyber risk. They have talent that understands business risk, but not cybersecurity risk. And so we're starting to see this show up on agendas a lot more. We're starting to see boards and audit committees inviting experts in to talk to them more about cybersecurity. It's still very much in the infancy stages right now, but if this is not a fairly frequent topic of conversation for boards and audit committees, and certainly risk committees to the extent that risk committees exist, and I think we'll talk more about that in a minute, but it should be a topic that they spend a fair amount of time talking about. I would encourage just about every audit committee member and board member out there to take a look at the National Institute of Science and Technology. Earlier this year published a framework for cybersecurity risk. Now, when I say the National Institute of Science and Technology, you may think that this framework is going to be something that is very difficult to comprehend, but it's not. It's about 39 or 40 pages. It's written so that the average person can really understand it. It makes a lot of sense, and it does give you a foundation to go back and ask some questions. So it's available for free out there on the NIST's website, so I would encourage that.
With the cyber risk, it seems like there's a challenge when we go back to this board composition issue, because you can't bring someone on the board that just knows IT, right, but doesn't have anything else to contribute to a board meeting. I mean, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense to just have this specialist sitting there waiting for the IT discussion. So if somebody has the senior experience and has the IT experience, that makes perfect sense. That becomes a very valuable person, and we're actually seeing boards recruit individuals that have that IT experience. I think if you would talk to the search firms, that is a pretty high priority right now, is to find those kind of people. But if you don't have that and you don't know the right questions to ask, and again, you sometimes as a board member, if you don't know the right questions to ask or what the right answers are, you don't know if you're getting a straight story from your own individual. And as much as you'd like to trust them, you really need somebody in the board sphere to be able to interpret and understand both what's being said and where something stands. So it does create a challenge that sometimes as a board you may need to go out and get help on somebody to help you interpret your own process and procedures that are in place.
I think that's right. And I think when you look at what we're dealing with here, the closest analogy to cyber risk is fraud risk. And most audit committee members and board members understand what fraud risk is. But when we're dealing with fraud, we are almost always dealing with somebody that's close to the organization, most often in the organization, or maybe a vendor or sometimes even a customer, but somebody that has access to information in the company. And so to some extent, we can put our arms around that. When we're talking about cybersecurity risk, we're talking about a team of people on an army base in a foreign country that have unlimited time and unlimited resources to plan their attack against your system. We could be talking about some techie in their grandmother's basement, again with unlimited time and availability to try to plan their attack. And so what's most important is not so much that it's important that the board and that the audit committee have the right resources, but the first thing you have to ask is, does the company have the right resources? Either full-time or engaged, does the company have somebody that's helping them plan out how to prevent an attack from happening and keeping up with the different ways that attacks are happening in the marketplace? And then when you look at the board and the audit committee composition, then you're looking for people that know how to ask the right questions. And to the extent you don't have those people, then you can engage them to come in periodically and assess your own experts, whether you've hired experts internally within the company or the company has engaged experts. You can engage a third party to come in and help evaluate what they're doing and what you're, as a company, doing with the tools that they've given you. You look at the Target example. Target actually had the right tools in place, and those tools actually worked, but they didn't follow up on the red flags that were raised. And what the company needs is to make sure that somebody's always asking those questions. What could happen next, and what are we doing to prevent it?
Yeah. Outside, this begs the question about risk committees, okay? And outside of financial services, which have a mandate to have risk committees, you don't see a lot of risk committees formed, although you're starting to see people give more thought to that. And so that means that responsibility for risk, even enterprise risk management, seems to be housed in the audit committee, okay? And I'm not sure, personally, I'm not sure if that's the right place for when you're talking about enterprise risk management, and particularly when you enter into the cyber risk space. So let's talk a little bit about what might be a growing trend of risk committees, what you would say to the world about the value of forming one, and then I'll give you a little bit of my opinion on what I think is a good path to follow.
Well, I think even if you look at just the way I've answered the questions today, and even some of what I said in the show last week, I've been a little bit schizophrenic in talking about whether or not we're talking about the board or the audit committee. And the reason I've been schizophrenic is because, particularly when we're talking about risk, beyond financial reporting risk, and we're talking about enterprise risk, that risk belongs to the whole board. And I think everybody understands that the board is responsible for making sure that the whole organization is effectively managing all the risks that could meaningfully impair its ability to function. But for the whole board to serve as a risk committee and deal with all of enterprise risk management kind of bogs the whole board down. It has been ceded to the audit committee in many cases, in part because of some of the governance requirements here at the New York Stock Exchange and some other suggestions that the audit committee is best equipped to deal with enterprise risk. And as a result, the audit committee sometimes has accepted some level of oversight responsibility for enterprise risk management, including cyber risk. Well, in their function of owning the financial reporting risk component of that, if they take on too much of the enterprise risk focus, they actually lose the ability to focus on their core mission, which is to make sure that financial reporting is accurate. So we are starting to see, and I think this is a good thing, we are starting to see a lot more the formation of risk committees that comprise members of other committees of the board and in the audit committee to make sure that we have a appropriate coverage across the whole board, but not bogging the whole board down in it. And I think it's important that we acknowledge that managing risk isn't always about avoiding bad things. It's about taking intelligent or making intelligent risk decisions, because businesses succeed in taking measured risks. So what you want is a whole board that has an overall bird's eye view of what's our long-term strategic plan as an organization, what are the meaningful threats to our ability to achieve that strategic plan. And then you need a risk committee that helps pick up some of the more specific risks, like cybersecurity, that can spend more time and drill down deep in some of those really meaningful risks. We formed audit committees to start with because there was quality financial reporting is critical to the success of business. And so the governance world realized many years ago that we needed a separate committee to focus on the financial reporting risk. Well, now we need a separate committee to focus on some of these other risks, because in the blink of an eye, they can have a significant impact on the company's ability to succeed.
Well, I share your concern that when cyber risk ends up in the audit committee, that it is so expansive that it's going to take away from their core responsibilities. So I have been slowly moving over to the camp that says you really do need a risk committee, even though I know people don't want to have a fourth committee and they don't want to do that. But here's my view of why I think that I've swung over 100% to needing it. When I look at the responsibility of the audit chair and the comp chair and even the nom-gov, but particularly in comp and audit, that chair owns that charter, okay? There is somebody that is looking at that on a regular basis to make sure, and they own that. If you try and spread risk over the whole board, nobody ends up owning it. Nobody ends up being that person on the board that has responsibility for it. But if I create a risk committee and I take that qualified director and say to them, you're in charge of the risk committee, here's the charter, okay? Now I have a higher level of comfort that somebody on the board owns that responsibility, okay? And then your suggestion is my suggestion as well. On that risk committee, I want the chair of the audit committee, the chair of the comp committee, and nom-gov, maybe somebody else, but at least I want them, so that now you have the enterprise risk, that these are the areas that each have their own risk, plus we have this black swan, cyber risk, whatever, that somebody's paying attention to. So that's what swung me to say, you've got to have a risk committee so that you have a chair that owns that risk.
Right. I couldn't agree more.
Well, that's a little scary, but
for you or for me?
Yeah, well, for both of us, I think. So, real quick, other key issues that you see out there, and obviously these are two enormous ones, but what else do you see out there relative to the audit committees need to pay attention to?
Well, I think the other thing I see audit committees wrestling with right now is social media and what to do with it. You know, we've got all of these different avenues out there for communicating with people, and we have different camps of people out there that are demanding that they be communicated with through these different channels, whether it's town hall meetings or Twitter, and my advice is to be careful in how you tread, because you know there are regulations out there about disclosure of information, and you want to make sure, and we've seen some companies have some issues with social media and getting information out there without getting it out in a broader way. So I would say, one, get some legal advice before you start heading down this road, but at the same time, you know, investors want to be communicated with. So I think audit committees and boards need to be thinking through who is our investor base, and what's the best way for us to give them timely information that meets all the regulatory requirements in a fair and balanced way. So.
Well, you have IP issues, you have investor issues. I mean, there's a ton of things that you have to worry about. The part that was a little bit disheartening with me is our latest survey with Spencer Stewart of what directors think. Some 19%, I believe, said that they have never discussed social media in the boardroom and don't plan in the future to discuss social media, okay? Now, the board isn't responsible for the policies, but they are responsible for overseeing that the company does have a policy. And any board that has not taken the initiative to do that is leaving themselves very vulnerable to all that can happen reputationally that we've seen through social media and the lack of a policy.
Well, and that's what's happened with some of these organizations where we've had executives participating in various forms of social media that have released things they probably shouldn't have, and you need somebody asking those questions. What are we doing to make sure that we've got control over the way we disseminate information?
Yeah. Well, Trent, it's always a pleasure. We always get to dive into this area, you know, to great depths. I appreciate you for joining us for the last 2 shows. Hopefully it's been helpful to our audience, and thanks again for joining us. And that will conclude this edition of This Week in the Boardroom. We hope you enjoyed the show. We will be back again next week to take a look at another critical topic, help you be a better board member and committee member, and we'll see you then.
Join us again next week for This Week in the Boardroom, brought to you by NYSE Governance Services, Corporate Board Member, along with Governance Knowledge Partners, the Center for Audit Quality, and Grant Thornton, and contributing partners, National Investor Relations Institute, and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.